Welcome to MagicGatheringStrat. I am Dan, and today I have a guest. It's David Shaffer. Hi, David.
Hello.
More known
Hi.
as Shaffer Waffer 5, perhaps,
Yeah,
or at least to
that's
some.
that's pretty much my name online
You're here because
everywhere.
we are going to talk about brewing, and you happen to be quite the master brewer.
I don't know about master, but I do my best to brew pretty much on the daily. Do always doing something.
Uh, you have done an article series on MTGO.com, and it's been talking mostly about brewing. Can you give us briefly your history in Magic?
Yeah. So if you saw my other video for this website, you'll know that I started around Mirage and around Ice Age, somewhere in there. I don't even know. I was pretty young. It was like the cool thing to do at the like daycare-ish place I was at, and we just play all sorts of games of Magic that were not correct at all. And then I slowly figured out how to actually learn how to play the game. And then once I learned that, I sort of took a break around, I don't know, like Onslaught-ish, and then I sort of just barely played. And then when Time Spiral or Time, yeah, Time Spiral came out, one of my friends asked me to do a draft with them, and it was like all the cool cards I grew up with, reprinted in different ways. So then I got back into the game pretty heavily, and I initially just started playing Pauper about that time because it was just the cheapest route. So I've been pretty much playing Pauper, and from that point forward, and I got really good, well, really into drafting around uh, Scars block. I would say is when or actually probably Zendikar is when I was really starting to like play a lot of limited. So now I play a ton of limited and a ton of Pauper, and I dabble in other stuff, but I really prefer eternal formats if I'm dabbling.
Yeah, and you don't net deck a lot when you play Pauper, do you?
It's almost like it's very difficult for me to get myself to do it. Like I will on occasion play decks, but if I'm doing that, it's usually it's one of two reasons. One, I'm either really frustrated because none of my brews are succeeding, or two, it's sort of like to gather research. Because sometimes the best way to beat a deck is to really understand how it works. Like
That's
if
very
you
true.
if you want to duress a Storm player, I think you need to have played Storm to understand which one would be the worst to, which card to lose would be the worst for you. So before you duress a Storm player, you should probably figure out what it's like to play Storm. This is kind of my viewpoint on that.
Very true. But let's start here with defining what brewing is.
Yeah, so to me, brewing is uh, anything from like tweaking a deck to like making a sideboard for the deck that's meta specific to an entire deck design. I think for a lot of people, when they think of brewing, they're focused more on the deck design aspect of it, but there's a lot of great beauty and nuance I've come to appreciate as I realize how amazing like small tweaks can be in a list, and just a few alterations in a sideboard can really take a list from questionable to the next level. So to me, it's just brewing is when you add your own like personal flair or decision to a stock list or to just a group of cards.
Yeah. I think I remember you saying that brewing a deck takes a day, or brewing a sideboard takes a month.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I can explain that if you want. I mean,
Please
it's
do.
so I can come up with an idea for a deck. And generally, when you have the idea for the deck, it's like, I don't know, 90%. You can just get it at 90%. Like, you know that you want a certain amount of lands to work. You know, you want this piece to, this creature to work with this spell. You just get this whole idea out on paper. And then you look at this deck and you're like, this is really cool, but I don't know how it runs. And so you play it against some deck that you think is actually like a really good matchup. Like on paper, it seems like it should be. And then it's not. And so then you realize this is a spot I need to dedicate to for a sideboard. So it's like maybe you think your deck's going to be great against Affinity, but it's not. And so you decide, now I need to add Dust to Dust. So it takes a lot longer to build a sideboard because you have to figure out what your deck's actually bad against. So before you can like really have a sideboard, and sure you can have like really broad generic cards like Circle of Protection Red or like Hydroblast or something, but those cards are like a good sideboard is one that attacks situations you have problems with instead of just like colors you have problems with. So the more you play, the more refined your sideboard list will get, and so it takes a month to do it, but you can come up with a deck in a day.
When you are building a new deck, looking at the first day, then when the 90% of the deck is completed, how do you start?
Well, there's like two ways to build a deck, and I actually think one is much better than the other, and yet people tend to do the worst one. So the first way, which is probably the worst way, is to try to build around a card or build around an interaction. So this is like pretty difficult to do because a build around card is a card you're going to get, you'll have 4 of usually in your deck. And so that means like in the top 15 cards of your library, you'll draw it somewhere probably. But a lot of games are over before you have the opportunity to get that far into your library. And so the card needs to be like incredibly powerful if you're going to try to build around a card. Like, so Temporal Fissure is a build around card. Like, that card is just so powerful that you can actually build around it. But a lot of other cards are not very powerful at all, and people still try to build around it. And so the other way, that's probably the better way to do it, is to come up with like a design theory for your deck. So the better way is to go like, okay, I want to make like a red aggressive deck. And so then you put the elements of a red aggressive deck into the list. So you might add some goblins, you might add some like Jackal Familiars, stuff like that, instead of saying I want to build a list around like Crew and Striker and then add a bunch of stuff that makes Crew and Striker good, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does.
And I think that's just a lot more successful because you're not planning on drawing the Crew and Striker in order to win.
That makes sense. Is there anything particular with Pauper that makes Pauper suitable for brewing?
Yeah, I actually think Pauper's got a lot of stuff going for it that other formats don't. First, obviously, is cost. Like, if you want to go off on a whim and make a deck in Standard, just to try it, see if it will work, you'll have to spend like $50, $60 on like even like bulk rares sometimes. And so it's just terrible, and you have to like have the right lands, because even if you're going to do like a crappy like random list, you're still going to have good fixing for it, and those are so expensive. So Pauper, it's like you're playing plains or islands usually, or just some basic, maybe a terramorphic expanse, a gate, or like a Karoo, and those are all like 10 cents. So it's just so cheap that you can dabble in this, give up on the idea, and then move on to something else and not lose any value. Then the next reason why is it's because to me it's eternal formats are better for brewing than rotating formats, because Wizards is like aware of what they're printing. It's very easy for them to look at a block and be like, okay, Thragtusk is a problem, or like Sphinx's Revelation is a problem, so we're going to print these other cards to combat it. So then like you just know when you look at a spoiler, like, oh wow, Wizards has made a card I have to play now. So like they give you almost like really linear options, and it's just not very good for brewing because there's just clear, you can look at a spoiler and usually figure out like this is the best deck. And then the last reason, and that's not the same in Eternal formats, because like there's just so many cards that are always changing, and you never know what a new set is going to bring, or like a banning or anything like that. It's just Wizards can't keep track of all these interactions. Like Invigorate, like they never expected Invigorate to be as good as it was, but it just crushed our format till it got banned. So they lose track of these things, and Eternal formats are better for that. And I think the last reason why Pauper is so good for brewing is it has a lot of visible meta shifts. So 1 week, Temporal Fissure could just be crushing, and then the next, everyone brings like Cyclops and Delver and Elves and just a lot of stuff that's really difficult for it. And so then it sort of like rotates, and then you can try to build a deck that will accommodate one of this like rock paper scissors aspects of it, and then you can succeed with the deck just because you happen to bring it at the right time. And every format has like a sort of rotating meta, but Pauper's I feel like is pretty easy to guess because there's not like a ton of really good decks, and because the decks are also sort of rock paper scissory in a lot of ways. So you just have to wait for the right time, and your brew might actually do really well.
When I first talked to you, was it 3 months ago, about Simic Stormpost in Pauper, you said basically that you liked brewing in Pauper, and I thought that this was a freak occurrence, that that deck was so powerful, you managed to make it, but I took it with a grain of salt that Pauper was good for brewing, because I thought that the powerful decks are so powerful. But now we actually have a discussion going on MTGO Strat based on your articles and in the comments to your articles, where several daily event result decks have shown up, like Azorius Kitty and Suicide White, etc. And people have actually scored in the dailies with these decks. So you are absolutely correct, and now I believe you.
Yeah, I think it's been really cool to see that, actually, just the progression of these decks that have popped up in the dailies from people who are saying that I sort of influenced their decision to build these decks just by like showing a list of cards usually. Like those articles I wrote about just the top 10 cards you're not playing in Pauper right now for each color. So many different people have mentioned to me like, oh, I tried building this list and it actually worked because these cards are good. And so I think a lot of the stagnation in Pauper is really the result of how new players gravitate towards Pauper. So they're just not used to seeing all the old cards. So brewing's difficult because you don't know that a certain card exists. And so because there's so many new players, because it's a cheap way to, rise up the ranks and get into standard or into Pauper or into modern if you just, grind some dailies. I think the design space is a little bit crimped because people just can't see that many cards, at once and take them all in and understand all the interactions. And so sometimes if you just highlight, we could really work on these cards here, people will actually do something pretty cool with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one other thing with Pauper that makes it specially suited to brewing is that, as opposed to any other Eternal format, it has not been played by the highest level of Magic players, by the pros, and Modern is fairly well explored by geniuses, but in Pauper there's still ground to break.
That's definitely true. I've actually heard that part of the reason why a lot of pros don't play Pauper is because they actually have a tough time moving from other formats to Pauper. Which is kind of strange. Yeah, and I didn't like come up with that by myself. Like an actual pro told me that. So it's based on fact that it's just, for whatever reason, it's difficult to transition. And I think part of that has to do with just like in Pauper, you really need to internalize the lists your opponents are playing. And I think a lot of pros just don't want to put in the time to do that.
Yeah,
more so than a lot of formats.
That's probably true. Anything else about brewing in general? That's a broad question. No. Let's move into specific deck types. If we look at brewing combo decks.
Yeah. So I wrote an article, actually 2 articles on each of these topics, like they're 2-part series. And the first one I did was brewing on combo, and I'll just kind of highlight some of the topics that I brought up in that paper. and I go more in depth in them in the articles, so you can go ahead and read them and learn more. But the first thing is in a combo deck is the power of the combo. So like a lot of people are really focused in Pauper on different combos that are like the Presence of Gone Midnight Guard combo. Like that's a pretty powerful combo because you can make infinite 1/1s, but you only make infinite 1/1s that have summoning sickness. So, and it's not an instant speed thing. So it's like kind of power. It's a pretty powerful effect because if you can do this, you make infinite 1/1s, and then the next turn you can attack and win. So that's pretty powerful, but it's not as powerful as say making infinite 1/1s and then casting Goblin Bushwhacker and winning. So when Empty the Warrens decks were making a finite amount of 1/1s, like 10, and then casting Goblin Bushwhacker to win, that's probably actually more powerful than the Presence of Gone combo because that haste is so relevant. And the first thing you really want to do in your combo deck is figure out how powerful what you're doing actually is. And if it's not really that powerful, it's probably not worth doing, which seems kind of straightforward, but you'd be amazed how many people try to exhume Ulamog's Crusher on turn 2 and attack with like Dragon's Breath on it to try to annihilate your opponent's permanents and swing for 8. And that's pretty powerful, but it takes 4 turns still, or actually 3 turns to win on that clock. And there's still plenty of stuff you can do to stop it that your opponent can do. So that's really not that powerful, but people will nonetheless, if you're brewing, you've probably tried Reanimator at some point. So the first thing you want to do is make sure what you're doing is actually really powerful. The second thing you want to do when combo is like have a ton of redundancy in your deck. Like if you have functional copies of like functional reprints or like near functional reprints like Chromatic Star and Chromatic Sphere, you want to be playing those. You want to make sure your deck runs really smoothly and goes quickly through its cards. And the main reason for this is because if you are going to try to combo off, you have to get your combo pieces. And that can be done in a lot of ways, either through like card draw. It can be done through just having 8 copies of effectively of a certain spell, and other stuff like that. But you need to have a really redundant deck. And then the next thing, kind of in line with that, is cantripping. You want to make sure that pretty much every combo deck is going to have some sort of cantripping effect, like Ponder, Preordain, Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star, just something, because it's going to. You need to draw cards. You need to draw them cheaply. So some of the better ones are like Manamorphose and Gitaxian Probe. But when you're cantripping, you also need to pay attention to your mana base, because the more times you cantrip, the more likely you're going to draw lands. And usually if you're trying to draw a lot of cards, the last thing you want to do is draw a lot of lands if you already have the appropriate mana out. So you want to make sure that your land count is low if you're cantripping a lot. And you also want to make sure you have ways to deal with the excess lands you get in your hand. So like Faithless Looting or something like that can draw you cards and filter out the excess lands. And then additionally, along the same kind of lines is the mana base. So again, you're going to be cantripping pretty quickly. And so you're going to run fewer lands. But you can also run a diversity of lands that a lot of the other archetypes can't run, because you are going to be running things like Manamorphose and Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star and stuff like that. Your mana is going to be flexible. You're going to be able to turn stuff into like green into blue, blue into white, whenever you need to. So your mana base can be a little bit shadier than the other ones, and so you can use things like the invasion block lands, and just all sorts of weird kind of Karoo-ish lands to fix. And your mana base should ultimately hold up, so you can be a little bit more flexible there. And then the last thing to note is creature-based combos are probably what we're going to have the most of in Pauper at this point, because with the banning of most of the Storm cards and the possible banning of Temporal Fissure in the future, and the pretty much terrible other Storm cards, although, I mean, maybe there's potential there, but if you are going to be brewing a combo in Pauper, it's probably going to be creature based. And so you're going to want to have ways to protect your combo pieces. And so cards like Shelter are really great here, and maybe even Disrupt, which is old common that no one ever plays, and it's actually pretty good. And so be wary of that, and make sure you have ways to, if you can, give them haste. So like the Presence of Gone deck is pretty good if you can have a hasty Midnight Guard that you can put Presence of Gone on, because then you can just make a ton of tokens. And so make sure you have ways to protect your guy or make him faster if you're going to go with a creature-based combo. You can see this a lot actually with like Kiln Fiend and Cyclops Fiend decks. So they have a ton of ways to protect their combo. And that deck even expresses a lot of the stuff I've highlighted in this article.
Very much so. Just speaking for a second about that deck, how many creatures would you run in Delver Fiend?
Well, I don't know. I guess I haven't played it enough to give you an honest answer, but I think I would definitely run, well, obviously the 4 Kiln Fiend, 4 Cyclops. I think I like the extra copy of the Wee Dragonauts in there.
Yeah.
I might even run 2. Delver has been surprisingly good lately in that deck.
I've seen a lot of people cutting Delver, or at least some people.
I've seen that too, but you really need to be careful with that. If you're going to do that, you absolutely need to run Flaring Pain in your sideboard, because if you don't do that, then you are stone dead to Circle Protection Red. Like, if they just cast Circle Protection to Red, you just lose. There's no way you can win without like backup Delvers. And so I know that doesn't seem like that big of a threat, but in like a Cyclops Fiend type list, that kind of the way you have to win is like against them is you have to like take out their threats. But Circle of Protection Red is one card that says I've taken out all of your threats. So I do like the Delver in that aspect because it's like an alternative win condition, and I don't know. I don't know that it's necessary to run it like all 4 of them. Even you might even just be fine running 2 Delvers, which is kind of strange, but and maybe 2 in the sideboard. But I don't know that I'm ready to lose them yet.
We're getting maybe too specific here. I just wanted to ask: is there any combo you would look into at this stage? There are the Fisher combos, the Delver Fiend stuff. Is there anything you could see in the future?
I am always working on something with Whirlpool Merfolk, I think is what it's called, or like Tellurian Winds, and then like ways to get a ton of stuff in your graveyard. So maybe like a Dredge effect and Hunting Misery or Scrapyard Salvo are like ways. And obviously these combos, this is pretty weak to just like any counter magic, but I think that there's a lot of design space here. Like we just got access to that Street Wraith guy who just also would like thin out a deck that's trying to do something like that. I think there's a lot of room for like Jace's Erasure type combos right now. It's a little bit slow and a little bit scary to play against Fissure Post, but I think you could do it if you added like Ceasefire to your list or something. So then you could, maybe you just, instead of like fogging all the time against Fissure Post, what you do is you'd Ceasefire, and then they couldn't play any of their Cloud of Fairies maybe to untap their stuff. They would have to Fissure you just cold with like Prophetic Prisms, which is pretty difficult for them to do. So I think that there's some ways that you can use Tellurian Winds and the Whirlpool Merfolk to do something broken. I haven't figured out what it is yet, but there's something there. I'm kind of interested lately in like Reap the Graves, and
that card is powerful.
The other Storm card that lets you find basics, which seems a little bit crazy. I forgot what that one's called, but those have been kind of interesting too. And Astral Steel is there always is like it's sort of like a bad grape shot, which is pretty terrible, but those are always there. I don't know. I haven't been too excited about much for combo lately. But I mean, there's always stuff you can try to do with Balustrade Spy to try to run like the 1 mana deck or something. I mean, I've tried that and it's okay. It'll never be competitive, but at least right now with the card pool we have. But there's pieces, and it's almost like if Wizards gives us like one more card in just the right direction, I think a good combo deck could appear.
Let's move on to Brewing Control decks then.
Okay, so in this article, I talk a lot about 1-for-1s and what I call more-for-1s. So the idea of control decks typically are to you really want to cast more for one. So this is like 2-for-1, 3-4-for-1, 5-for-1, something like that. And the thing with that is that those cards are really expensive. So your deck is dictated on a few things. One, you can't have too many more for ones in your hand at a given time because you'll get run over by faster decks. So you have to make sure that your curve allows you to take care of fast, aggressive strategies. And so this requires playing 1-for-1s in your deck. So like cards like Flame Slash or Terror or Doomblade. Those are just 1-for-1s that are powerful. They can take out some random creature that's beating you down pretty quickly. And then you want to be playing enough lands so that you can cast a land every turn, and then eventually hit your more for ones. And so that could be something like a Muldrifter or a Rolling Thunder for 10, like wipe their board. It could be all sorts of different things along those lines. But the idea of control in Pauper has usually been 1-for-1, 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 and then once you can, you start more for one-ing, and you take control that way. The best route people have figured out to do this is with Cloudpost, because it allows you to, even though it's a little bit of awkwardness early on, it lets you ramp quickly into your more for ones, and the moment you start more for one-ing, the game starts to turn in your favor. So you want to have probably somewhere around, like, I guess, of your spells, like maybe 60% 1-for-1s and 40% more for ones. And I think that's pretty close approximation. And then the next thing with Brewing Control is figuring out how you're going to win and making sure that your win condition is avoids edge case scenarios. So when you are looking at your win condition, you don't want to have too many of them, because they're going to get gummed up in your hand and not do much. Like Rolling Thunder is really unique in the fact that it doubles as a win condition late and a removal spell, a 1-for-1 or a more for one early. So it's a pretty unique card in that. But a lot of other controller strategies need to have ways to win, which are like Ulamog's Crusher, or just like, I mean, you could sort of look at Temporal Fissure decks and look at their win condition, which is just a bunch of little like dudes. And so you want to make sure that you can protect your win condition, but you're not like filled with them too much, because if you have a handful of Ulamog's Crushers on turn one, you're gonna have to mulligan that hand. So, and that's probably the same with Rolling Thunders too. So you want to have very few win conditions, but you want to make sure that if your opponent deals with your win condition, it's not just game over for you. So you need to make sure that if you're running like Rolling Thunder, and that's the only way you can win, that you have some way to defeat a turn one duress if they get your Rolling Thunder. So that might include, playing Mnemonic Wall in your list, or if you are going the Ulamog's Crusher route, maybe playing Grim Harvest as well to get that back. And then you usually also want to have a backup plan of some sort of like value out strategy. So like usually what the post decks have been doing is they'll play Muldrifters as sort of a backup win condition, because if your Crusher doesn't work or your Rolling Thunder gets to rest and then Bujuka bogged, you can't just roll over. So you want to have one really strong win condition, roughly one, and ways to protect it and make sure that it can win you the game. But you also want to have a backup plan in case that doesn't work. You really need to plan for these edge cases. Like, you want to make sure that your Temporal Fissure deck maybe has a Mnemonic Wall, because if it doesn't, you might just lose to Guardian of the Guild Pact on the ground, and then once their permanents get bounced up, they have like 2 Prismatic Strands they pitch in the graveyard, and if your only win condition is Karavic's Torch and you don't have the Mnemonic Wall, then you just lose. Even though you've crushed him in the entirety of the game, you just lose to this edge case scenario. So you want to make sure that doesn't exist. Then the next part about brewing for control is what I call the land destruction test. So you can make a great like blue-white control list, or like blue-green. Well, blue-green kind of works, control list. But the problem you're going to have is that land destruction is really key, and in the control mirror. So when you go against the blue-red version, against your blue-white version, you don't have access to land destruction. So they're going to just start blowing your lands up, and this prevents you from casting your More for Ones or multiple spells in a turn. And so the land destruction test requires you to make sure that you can protect your lands, get back your lands, or destroy your opponent's lands at the same or similar rate to how they're blowing up yours. And if you can't do that, your control list is probably going to lose your opponent's control list. So you want to make sure you can pass the land destruction test. And the last thing to talk about is the redundancy of similar effects in control lists. A lot of times control lists have fewer 4-ofs than aggro lists and combo decks, and this has to do with the ability to draw into these cards and or tutor them up or do something where they have some sort of method to have cards that are pretty similar. So maybe like Prohibit and Counterspell. Like, it might, early on, Counterspell might be a little bit worse than Prohibit, but you kind of want both in your deck, because maybe later on you just want to Mnemonic Wall back a Counterspell. So you want this like diversity in your deck, but you still want to have a certain amount of Counterspells. So if you have a way to take advantage of the diversity in your deck, you should really try to do it, but make sure that you still have redundancy of similar effects. So make sure that you have, a certain amount of creature removal, a certain amount of counter removal, and counter magic, I guess, and other stuff like that, so that in card draw, I guess, would be the last one, so that you can, even though you're drawing like slightly different counter spells, I think the flexibility you'll receive late game is going to pay off in spades. So that's why you see a lot of lists with a lot of 1-ofs and 2-ofs, because they have ways to stave off the weirdness of the differential, of the counterspell that's like a little bit wrong early on, and take advantage of the flexibility late. So that's kind of it for brewing control lists.
Where do you see some brewing potential in when it comes to control decks?
I think a good control deck has to have land destruction, personally. So that allows us in red, black, and green. And so really, I think that we've seen black, we've seen red, so maybe like a blue-green list could pop up. I know it's been kind of tried now and then, but I really think that there's some room there that has yet to be explored.
And what would happen if Cloudpost was banned? I have to ask. Wouldn't that open up control a lot?
Would it open up control a lot?
I think Cloudpost decks shut off a lot of other control decks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I think you'd see a lot more signets played. I think would be the first thing you'd see an increase in. And then a lot more like, I guess I just sort of feel like if Cloudpost was taken out of the format, really aggressive decks might be a little bit too powerful, but I'm not willing to say that for sure. It could just be that the reason why other control decks don't really exist is because Cloudpost control decks are just better, and not that aggressive decks beat them. So I don't
think
know.
you
I
can
mean, I
achieve
think,
control against aggressive decks with black, with sort of your own Azorius Kitty build, Reality Acid stuff. And then stopping the control decks is not the problem. Stopping the aggro decks is not the problem when brewing control decks, really. It's the Cloudpost matchup that stops most control decks.
I can see that.
And the land destruction test then, which the Izzet Post decks excel at.
Yeah, I feel like that's more the issue than the amount of mana generated. Because, I mean, what are the Cloudpost decks doing that a normal control deck isn't really? In terms of, like, maybe they're ramping slightly faster, but it doesn't seem like they're doing that much. Because, like, why do you feel that Cloudpost decks beat out other control decks?
I think it is a common conception because maybe it's just because of the land destruction suite that they get to their late game a lot faster than the other control decks do, and then they, by the land destruction, can stop the other control deck from getting to the late game and doing the more offs.
Yeah, to me, it's like it's all about land destruction, and maybe capsize is like the big issue too. Like, I know that that's whenever I try to brew control, it's like the moment I start getting capsized, I just groan if I don't have an answer for it. But
True.
I don't know. It's I do think that the mana is important, but I don't know that.
Do you think we would see similar decks using the Ursa Tron base if Cloudpost was gone?
No, I don't. Because that's just too much colorless mana for the deck to handle at a control level. Like, sometimes Cloudpost decks are a little bit awkward when they're turn 1 Cloudpost, turn 2 Glimmerpost. If they don't have the Prof Prism, they need to continue to hit their land drops, and they have a tough time. So if you have to go turn 1, like Urza's Tower, turn 2 Urza's Mine, turn 3 Urza's Power Plant, like just to get any additional mana, that is just not going to help you. And plus, the life gain in Glimmerpost usually like mitigates the awkwardness of those draws.
That's very true.
So you lose the life gain, and so I just don't think Control has any business playing the Urza lands. I do think a Fissure Post deck could maybe alter to that. It'd be substantially worse, but it's possible.
All right, let's move over to talking about brewing aggro decks.
Okay, so aggro decks, I think people have a tough time just believing the truth on this issue. Not play what I'm going to call a turn 1 aggro deck in more than one color. So you can't, if your plan is to play like a 2/2 on turn 1, and that's just it, and then maybe like another 2/2 for 1 on turn 2, and then a 1/1 on turn 2, you cannot make your deck 2 colors if that's your plan. Like, it just will not work. It will be slower than whatever aggro deck already exists in the current color. So if you are just fiddling around with your mana base, like, you're gonna have to play. If we had like shots in our format, then maybe this wouldn't be the case. But because we have tap lands, you're just going to be a turn behind all the time, and you're going to have to play cards like Avacyn's Pilgrim or like Elves of Deep Shadow just to like fix your mana, so that you can then cast something that's pretty similar in power level to what the on-color deck is trying to do. So if you're going to build a deck that's like that linear, and it's just like play 1 mana creatures or like 2 mana creatures and just beat face, pump them, or add burn, or do something like that, it needs to be 1 color. Now, you can have something I call a turn 2 aggro deck, which can be 2 colors. So these would be like your Affinity and your auras, which is sort of like the first couple turns are sort of set up. You're not really doing very much that's powerful. You might be adding an aura to a land, or maybe making a Springleaf Drum, but you're not doing anything big on turn 1. Turn like 2 and 3, you start ramping up. You start playing a Frogmite, you start playing a 1/1 and put an Ethereal Armor on it, things like that. And then by about turn 3 and turn 4, you are exploding. You are dropping your entire hand of 4/4s into play, or you are adding Ancestral Mask and making your Hexproof guy like a 14/14. So if you're going to build an aggressive deck like this, you actually can play multiple colors, and that's why these decks do. Is because you can spend the first few turns fixing, and then the rest of the game exploding. And the way that's best to do this is you have to make sure that what you're doing is really powerful, something that will make up for those lost early turns. So I think we can all agree that an army of 4/4s on turn 3 is very, very powerful, and maybe not as powerful as like Empty the Warrens or like Temporal Fissuring, but in terms of like what aggressive decks can do, it's very powerful. And the same can be said for like Ethereal Armoring and Ancestral Masking and Rancoring a 1/1. It's a very powerful thing. It's more powerful, arguably, than, or it can be more powerful than playing it 2/2 for 1 on turn 1 and then a 1/1 and a 2/2 on the following turn. So if you're going to go in a 2-color aggressive deck, you need to make sure that you are doing something really powerful on turns 3 and 4 and fixing early. And so if you're going to be doing that, you need to play things like Avacyn's Pilgrim, Springleaf Drum, Utopia Sprawl, Fertile Ground, stuff like that, so that you can make sure that you fix. And so if you're not going the affinity route, which is sort of like been pretty tested, and there's very little design space available on that, because besides like Alara and Mirrodin, both Mirrodin blocks, there's not really that many like artifact-centric blocks, and so most of the cards in there have been sort of tried. So really the design space I see for aggressive decks would be would probably be like the 2-color turn 2 decks that are not artifact based. And so if you're going to do this, you need to make sure you're fixing. And if you're going to be fixing, well, then you probably need to play green, just the way the cards work. And if you're probably going to play green, then you probably want to play something like Avacyn's Pilgrim or Elves of Deep Shadow or like Utopia Sprawl. And so you're kind of locked into trying to make, I think, currently, aggressive decks that are, green-white or green-black. And I think that that's sort of the takeaway I wanted to say with brewing aggro, is if you're going to try to brew aggro, try to build a turn 2 aggressive deck that is green-black or green-white. And I think that those are the biggest areas for design space that we haven't really touched upon in this format.
Do you think there's any design space for building a turn 1 aggro deck that is not seen now?
So I do think that there's some possibility for it, but you really need to pay attention to what you're doing. So I built a new Goblins deck that takes sort of what Goblins does and sort of turns it on its head. With the addition of Foundry Street Denizen and Kruin Striker, I've added a lot of Goblin token makers and things like that. And so I'm taking what Goblins does and makes it a little bit different. And I don't know that necessarily it's even better than Goblins, but in the right meta, I do think it is, because it's a little bit more explosive. So I think we can definitely see, deviations. But in general, I mean, what most of these decks have done is they have taken all of the 2 power for 1 mana creatures that are available to them and just jammed them into a deck. And so you're just really going to see, like, there's just not that much design space in it, because there's just aren't that many cards that do that. And then, like, the one place people always try to make work, but will never really work, is mono black aggressive. And I do want to caution people here, because whenever you look at what people are doing with those lists, they are playing, the same things like 2/2s for 1 mana, but their 2/2s for 1 mana do the same thing as what every other color's 2/2 for 1 manas do, except your mono black 2/2s for 1 mana also deal damage to you on your own turn. So you're basically playing like Goblin Cohort that does a damage to you every turn. And if you're playing against another aggressive strategy, that's awful. So everything that black can do from an aggressive standpoint is done better by the other colors. So if we're going to see like a breakout, I think it'd probably be mono white, because I feel like Wizards keeps giving us good aggressive mono white creatures and less so with the other colors lately. So I could see mono white breaking through at some point, but not mono black. And we might see slight deviations in red and in green, and not mono blue, because there's like nothing really to be that aggressive with.
True. Well, thank you for these insights. Before we finish today, do you have one piece of advice to prospective brewers out there? What should they think about?
So I used to think mid-range was dead. I used to think that there was just no way you could ever make it successful. But then after I realized that the main reason why I thought this was because of Storm and Infect. And those decks were just so fast and just attacked on such a different axis that it was pretty hard to deal with them. And so now that those decks aren't here and the format's a little bit slower, even though Temporal Fissure decks can still like generally crush a mid-range deck, I think there's a lot of room to explore there, as long as you are making sure that your mid-range deck can attack like a person's Cloud Posts. So and this has been because of the Boros Kitty and my own experiments with the Azorius Kitty list. I've been pretty impressed with what these mid-range decks can do, and so make sure that if you're going to do a mid-range deck, it's got game against the entire field, and I think you'll do okay. You can actually brew something there.
All right, thank you very much, and I'll be looking forward to more articles in your Thoughtcast series.
Yeah, every Thursday I try to get them out.
All right. Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, thank you.